Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. I'm the author of the Tanyuan Academy series, and this is English Nerd. So today I wanted to talk about plotting and pantsing. Basically, these are two ways of approaching a novel. Plotting is planning everything meticulously in advance. Pantsing is not doing that. It's going blindly into the dark. And so the term that I prefer, since pantsing is kind of a dumb word, I mean, I get it. There's nice alliteration, seat of your pants, and all of that. But the term that I prefer is discovery writer, which is, I believe, coined by Brandon Sanderson. So I'll be using those terms interchangeably. Now, most people don't fall very much on one side or very much on another side. It's a spectrum. Personally, I was much more of a discovery writer, and now I am much more of a plotter, but I'm still kind of in that gray area in between. Now, there are famous writers who have been both plotters and pantsers. J.K. Rowling very famously plotted with meticulous care her Harry Potter series, and then Stephen King doesn't plot anything for any of his books. He's very famously a discovery writer. So this video is not meant to be a video about how one is better than the other, but I do want to make you aware of some of the pros and cons of choosing each of these routes, especially if you are just starting out. So I'm going to start with the pros of plotting. Those are kind of the most well documented and I think are worth bringing up first. So number one, you know where your story is headed from the get-go, so you can do things like foreshadow. You can do things like head in the direction of the ending with the ending in mind, and it really makes the writing in some ways much easier because you know what's happening. Secondly, and on a related note, you're less likely to get stuck in a hole. This happened to me when I was writing Firian Rising. I started it in high school, if you're not aware of my story. And I discovery wrote the whole beginning, almost the entire first draft of the first novel, and I had all kinds of subplots that I tried out, and I ended up getting myself horribly stuck. I basically wrote myself into a hole. And so if you plot in advance, that's much, much less likely to happen. And it can also prevent that saggy middle syndrome that happens with a lot of first, second-time writers. Even the beginning is exciting, the end is exciting, but what do you do in the middle to keep the tension up? Well, if you plot, then you can plan for that in advance and have these different things in place that will keep that tension going all the way through to the end. Number three, plotting makes it easier to fast draft. That has been one of the huge pros for me. I'm a high school English teacher, as many of you know, and so I tend to do most of my drafting in June, at least a good half of the book, and I write pretty long books, so it's like my own personal NaNoWriMo, but it's in June, so nobody knows or cares. But since I plan my stories in advance, I am able to write them much more quickly because I know where I'm going, I know what needs to happen, and I'm not left wondering. Number four, you're more easily able, if you're a plotter, to apply plot structure. Now, some of you out there might be thinking, but that's so confining. Everything doesn't need to be cookie cutter. Completely agree. However, for most stories to feel satisfying, there needs to be some kind of plot structure involved, whether that's a through line or a hero's journey or a 15-beat structure. There are lots of different ways to go about things. But if you don't have any plot structure at all, you're going to lose readers. There are very rare exceptions, but pretty much you're going to lose readers because they don't understand what the prevailing goal is, what the character arcs are, and some of those things that you need to nail down later on if you're not going to do it in advance. So, and then finally, number five, the last pro, and a huge pro for me again, is that there's usually less heavy-duty editing at the end. Now, that isn't to say that there is no editing. No. I just finished the third draft of Kingdoms on Fire, the finale to the Tanyuan Academy series, and there was a ton of editing, but there was less of the huge structural getting rid of chapters, getting rid of subplots, all of that kind of stuff that I had to do with Firian Rising, which was written as a discovery writer. So moving on to the cons then, what are some of the cons? If there are all these pros to being a plotter, what are some of the cons? It can sometimes make for less character-driven stories. At least this is how some people feel. If you plot everything in advance, then it can feel more plot-driven. The characters have to go from A to B, that sort of thing. And so it's important as a plotter to make sure that you also know your characters very well, so you don't fall into the trap of making them just kind of go through the motions and not have it feel like it's their story that they own, which is easier to achieve, some say, if you're discovery writing and following the characters instead of starting off with this plot already set in stone. Again, it's a gray area. It's not necessarily that a plot has to be set in stone. You can shift things around. I know I definitely have. But anyway, that can be a con. Number 2 is that a lot of people think that plotting is just less fun. I mean, that's a legitimate con. Some people want the thrill of discovering new things every time they sit down, and if you have already plotted a lot of that out, you're going to have fewer moments like that. And it can be less fun than seeing where the story goes. And finally, the last and most significant con, I think, is that you have way more work on the front end before you can really get your writing going. So I have a book that I'm planning on writing after the Tanyman Academy series is finished, and I'm going almost full plotter for this one, but it is a whole lot more work on the front end. I mean, I'm going scene by scene, and so I'm just outlining the entire thing, and then when I have some space to write, then I'm going to get a bunch of those scenes finished. So that's it for pros and cons with plotting. If you're wondering why I keep looking down, I know it's like not the most professional thing. I have everything written down right there, and there's not a convenient place in front of me for that to go. So thank you for bearing with me. I wanted to stay on track today. So moving on to pantsing. Pantsing is where you're discovering as you go. What are some of the pros to doing that? I've already alluded to some of them, but some people think, this is pro number 1, that it's way more fun and way more authentic to write this way, that you are fully yourself, that you're not forced into some kind of box. There's a freedom and a fun that goes with it, and you can experiment and, of course, delete things if they're not really working, but there's a freedom that comes with discovery writing, which is why I still sometimes do it. I've definitely started projects, even in the last year, where I wasn't really sure where it was going to go. And then I figured it out, and I did that mix, but it can be just a complete blast. Another pro is that there is less work beforehand. You don't need to do anything at all. If you want to just sit down without any planning, any thought, and just go, then you can do that. There's no extra work or criteria before you begin. You don't have to know the sense of humor of your fantasy culture. Like, just figure it out as you go. That's a pro. Number 3 is that your characters can drive the story as you follow them around. Again, you can have a character-driven story as a plotter. I'm not saying that it's, plot-driven versus character-driven, but it can be easier to have a character-driven story when it really is just the characters that you're following. And then number 4, the final pro, is that the story and the characters will surprise you more often as a discovery writer, and that is just a blast, kind of stumbling upon things that happen and traits about your characters and immediately following through with that what if idea. So definitely some pros to discovery writing, but as with everything, there are some cons as well. So these are the 3 major cons that I see. Number 1, it's harder to keep up that story tension, especially in the middle. It's easier to drive yourself into that hole. Just like I said, it was a pro to be able to avoid those things. As a plotter, it's a con to have that happen to you potentially as a discovery writer. Number 2, there is a good chance that you'll have to cut a lot that you really like in order to make your story better in the editing process. So you might have to cut whole scenes or subplots. I know I had to cut so many subplots from Firian Rising because I'd have an idea. I would think, ooh, how cool, how fun, I'll just follow up on that. But then, as I was editing, I realized that it didn't really have much to do with the character arcs, didn't really have much to do with the themes. I wasn't sure where I was going with it, and it just didn't progress the story at all. So I needed to cut, it ended up being over 100 pages. And, in some cases rewriting to make it better. So be aware that that is a possibility. It's not true of everybody, but it is a possibility. And it kind of feeds into number 3, the biggest con, that there is going to be more work after you finish the book to retrofit plot into it. Now, again, you're not trying to put your story into a box necessarily, but you want people to feel like it is a complete story, that it is something that makes sense, that they can go from A to B and feel like it was a plan all along, like Neil Gaiman says. The first draft is just for getting it out there. The second draft is for making it look like you knew what you were doing the whole time. And that's much more of a challenge when you've discovery written the whole thing. So Firian Rising, like I said, was mostly discovery written, the first draft. And that took way, way more intense editing than my other 2 books that were a little bit more plotted. Now, that isn't to say that I didn't have a lot of editing to do with Into the Unreal and Kingdoms on Fire. I did, but it was less getting rid of a ton of stuff and completely redoing it, and more, tweaking things and small to mid-sized adjustments rather than so many large adjustments. So there you go. It really boils down to personality, what you prefer, and where you're willing to put in that extra work. Is it at the beginning? Is it at the end? Or do you want to fall somewhere in the middle like I do and maybe plot your major A, B, C, D points, but not exactly how characters get there, so you can kind of let them figure it out on their own. So let me know. I'm sure I left out some pros and cons of plotting and being a discovery writer. So put those down below. Let me know which one you are, and if you have any questions, like this video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe for more English nerdy goodness, and I will see you on Monday. Bye.